Addictions, afflictions, and compulsive behaviors are a part of our common human experience. And therefore, no one is exempt from addressing them. This is a common human ailment.
Welcome to Real Faith, Real World, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. This podcast is a resource of World Methodist Evangelism, where we connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. Learn more on our website, worldmethodist.org. My name is Rob Haynes. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the generosity of the folks at Christ Church Memphis. We are so appreciative of their continued support of this ministry. You know, issues of addiction have been with us since the very beginning. Sometimes the church has done great work in helping those affected by addiction. And sometimes the church has fallen woefully short. Today, my guest is the Reverend George Acevedo. He is the co-pastor of Grace Church in Cape Coral, Florida. He has an amazing testimony about his own journey in recovery, and he tells us that the lessons from and the steps in recovery may very well transform the church today. George, welcome to Real Faith, Real World.
It's good to be with you.
You know, I know that you have a real passion for working with people who are dealing with issues around addiction. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, my name is George Acevedo, and I am a follower of Jesus for 43 years this month. And for the last 25 years, I've been the lead pastor at Grace Church in Cape Coral, Florida. We are a multi-site congregation with a whole bunch of fresh expressions of church as well. And I'm married to Cheryl for 40 years, and we have 2 adult children and 4 of the most beautiful grandbabies in the world. So it's a little bit about me.
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned, one of the focuses that you've given to ministry has been those who are affected by addiction. And, you know, those can be in every context and setting. Maybe people are listening to this in the United States or any other part of the world. But can you give us a little bit of the scope of the problems of the addiction that you focused on?
Sure. Well, I'm a local church pastor, and so one of the downsides of that is that you can get pretty myopic around your church or your community. Yeah. But I have been privileged in my work to travel globally and internationally, and as well as domestically. Excuse me. And what I would say is that I found the issue of addiction to be a common thread in every culture. In the East and in the West, in the North and in the South.
Right.
That the issue of addiction has been an issue for humankind as long as there have been substances, whether it was wine or methu, I think they called it in the Greek in the first century. Yeah. Food, sex, these have been issues of addiction. Have been at work in the human family, I would gather, since Genesis 3 to now. Yeah. That you can see even in the pages and the narratives of the Old Testament and the New Testament, these threads that would point to addictions, afflictions, and compulsive behaviors. I'll use the language of Rick Warren: hurts, habits, and hang-ups that take up residence in the hearts and lives of human people. And we say at Grace Church that everybody's got an it. And you might not know what your it is, but if you talk to the people who are closest to you, they will gladly tell you about your it. And you can try to forget it, or shop it away, or sex it away, or sleep it away, or drink it away, but it still remains, and it needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
And so the issue of addictions, afflictions, compulsive behaviors is a part of our human condition. Theologically, I would tie it to sin, to the doctrine of sin. Yeah. If we believe that sin separates us from God, It's anything that separates us from God. Any attitude, any action. If it's anything that separates us from God, then we can imagine that what we call around our church the unholy trinity, evil above us, Satan and his hordes, evil around us, the world and our culture, evil within us, the flesh, that evil cooperates with itself and our brokenness to lead us to places of sin where we are separated from God, those things that keep us from God. And again, that can be a dopamine deficiency in our brain, or that can be an addiction to porn or alcohol or a codependency. I think everybody has at least one codependent relationship.
Right.
And so this is a part of the human problem. It's a part of the reality of, in the emotionally healthy spirituality, family, and conversation, they often use the word humans have limits. And I would categorize addictions under one of our limits.
So talk about that emotionally healthy spirituality just a little bit more for somebody who might not be familiar with that.
Sure. Pete Scazzaro, who was the pastor at New Life Fellowship in, I believe it's Brooklyn, New York, now pastored by Rich Villados. I can never say his name right. Pete championed the idea that you can only grow spiritually to the extent that you grow emotionally. And that often the cap on our spiritual growth is our unwillingness to deal with our emotional baggage.
Yeah.
And he focuses particularly on our family of origin issues. And again, part of the sin problem is that we wound one another in our families that we grow up in. There is no perfect mother or father out there.
Right.
There are no perfect kids. And so we grow up and we get wounded to some degree or another in all of our human homes. And we bring that with us into our adulthood, and that we need to address those issues. Those are often the very issues that addictions tap into. So we use alcohol or drugs or working too much or having too much sex or having too many bad relationships to kind of calm the savage beast that's within us. And it's interesting that in the biblical narratives, that when Jesus often would confront a person that the New Testament would call, the gospel writers would call demon possessed, Jesus would ask the demon to name itself.
Yeah.
Because you have to name it to exorcise it, to heal it. And for a lot of people, they don't want to name their family trauma. Sadly, and you and I both know this, there are people that grow up in tragic homes where there's all kinds of abuse and neglect. And there's people who grow up in good homes, but who grow up with bad habits that they pick up from mom and dad. My wife grew up in an idyllic home, beautiful Christian mom and dad, but they're as codependent as the day is long. So what did my wife bring into our marriage? A codependency. I grew up in a very dysfunctional home, an alcoholic home. I brought my alcoholic propensities into our marriage, and we were a perfect storm for a bad marriage. And it took a lot of therapy, a lot of recovery, a lot of spiritual formation to get us to 40 years of marriage. And we're doing wonderful today.
That's great. And, George, you've talked about the global scope of this, and we've talked about the biblical background of this. So we know that the problem is wide and deep and long. Yes. But what about the pandemic? What has that done to these issues around addiction?
Well, all it's done is, you remember when we were kids, we would take the magnifying glass and get the sun and burn the ants or whatever. Yeah. All it's done is do that to our unhealth, our unhealth. And you can put a lot of things under our unhealth. Right. Addictions, emotional stuff, all of that kind of fits under that category. And I would say all it's done is expose that. It's been said, I heard it said that this was talking about churches, but I think it's true of our own emotional and spiritual wellness or lack thereof, that when COVID came, the tide went out and we found out who was not wearing pants. Yeah. And so what we've experienced at our church is that depression is up, anxiety is up. Our people in our recovery ministries who you would never think would go out and use again are going out and using. And sadly, we had a week a few months ago where we had 3 people die within a period of 2 weeks.
Oh, wow.
That their addictions led to overdoses, which led to their death.
And that happens sometimes, we know, around, the holidays. We think of Christmas and Thanksgiving and New Year's and all of that. But also we know this from the rhythms of the year. I mean, you and I, serving in pastoral ministry, have seen this at things like weddings and funerals and all these other sort of things that come along. You're talking about just exposing what's already there. So I think the point I'm trying to make is this is not a limited thing to its time or to its scope or to a particular population or income or anything like that.
What I think is different is that COVID has been protracted. I mean, it's been elongated. Mm-hmm. And so we're talking about, we're into year 2 or is it year 3? We're getting ready to go to start year 3.
Yeah, that's right.
In March.
Right.
And so you think we're finishing 2 years. I mean, I always experienced in pastoral ministry that during December, during Christmas, I was going to get a phone call or two from somebody who kind of hit their rock bottom because of the holidays, the sadness, they're not with family or whatever it might be.
Right.
But this has been 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's been like Chinese water torture. I mean, I don't know that a week has gone by in the last year where we haven't had to mention this idea of this elongated COVID season that we're in, because so much of the good news addresses these kinds of very seasons of life.
The last time you and I were together was leading a retreat just as we were hearing of the lockdowns happening. And that retreat finished on March the 13th when everything shut down. And we were thinking, oh, this is going to blow over. But, here we are. So that's kind of the landscape that we're in. But let's talk about the church's role in this. Now, it hasn't always been polite to talk about this in church, because many times at church, those who may attend regularly or maybe just turning up don't want to admit, or they just say, "Oh, everything's fine," and they sweep it under the rug. What has been the church's response historically? I guess let's start there.
Yeah, it's been broad and varied, from those who have, you could almost say aggressively pursued those who are struggling with addictions, to shunning and everything in between.
Right.
And so I don't know that there's a simple answer to that. But I would say this, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the grandfather of all of the A's, NA, CA, SA, all of the Addictions Anonymous groups. Bill W. And his friends were rooted in the long history and tradition of the church. They had connected with Sam Shoemaker and some of the Holy Club folks, and they were the AA and the 12 steps are grounded and rooted in the pages of Scripture. The 3rd steps of Alcoholics Anonymous is, surrender my life to the care and control of God as I understand.
Yeah.
And in the early days, Bill W. would take folks upstairs. They would put them on their knees. They would lead them to Christ and give them a copy of the Bible in my utmost for his highest. So the roots of Alcoholics Anonymous are very much rooted in the church. Over the years, though, and I think it's with wisdom, there became, I wouldn't say separation from the church, there became a broadening. So they added to the phrase God, the God of your own understanding. Mm-hmm. And for those of us, most of us who would be listening to this podcast are in the Wesleyan stream.
Right.
What they were tapping into is prevenient grace.
Yeah. Yeah.
That you can put your faith in something, and we believe that the God of the universe is already out there working in front of us, drawing that person into a personal relationship with Christ. Yeah. Or as a dear friend of mine said to me, the God of your understanding can be a doorknob, but I believe that Jesus will reveal himself through that doorknob.
Yeah.
And we've experienced that, we've experienced that over and over and over again. As men and women will come into the doors of our church through traditional recovery, they'll come to our Christian recovery, and there they'll come to faith in Jesus. and and then step into the life of the church.
Yeah. So give us a year when you're talking about Bill W., just for people who may not be familiar with the history.
I am not an expert on that. It's within the last 100 years.
Okay. So, yeah. Just what I was hoping to get was, early 1900s and that sort of thing. So, and I think you're absolutely right about that prevenient grace. And let me testify to that as myself. My father was an alcoholic and quit drinking when I was around 7 or 8 years old. And I remember going to meetings with him and sitting in the back and eating, stale donuts and drinking bad coffee and listening to the testimonies of the others in the room. This was back in the late 70s, so there's smoke everywhere. I mean, it was very stereotypical in the basement of a church or something like that. But I remember always the big book being around, and talking about higher power and listening to people come to terms with all that they had to deal with. Later in life, my father, when I was in my late teens, became a Christian and was baptized, and was through the ministry of a small town West Kentucky preacher who really reached out to him. And I saw the handles that my dad had developed in those early years of recovery now coming to fruition, as he was grabbing onto something in his own faith life then.
Yeah. Well, let me for our friends who don't understand or know about the 12 steps, if you give me 2 minutes, I'll give you just this quick overview.
Please.
Steps 1, 2, and 3 get people right with God. They admit they're powerless. They admit that there's a God who can fix them, and they ask that God to do that. Steps 4, 5, 6, and 7 get me right with myself. Remember, it's love God, love yourself so that you can love your neighbor.
Yeah.
This is where we do the deep dive work. We name the good, the bad, and ugly of our life. We confess it to God, somebody else. We ask God to reveal to us our defects of character, the root causes of our behavior, and then we ask God to deliver us from that. And then, so that's steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. Steps 8 and 9 is we get right with our neighbor. We make a list of those that we've harmed, and then we make amends. And so I've loved God, I've loved myself, I've loved my neighbors in step 8 and 9, and then steps 10, 11, and 12 keep me right with God, neighbor, and self. And especially step 12 is the evangelistic step, if you will, where I'm giving it away to other people. Yeah. And so it comes full circle. And so, I mean, you can see very clearly that this is if you will, a biblically based program. Yeah. It follows both the wisdom of the Old and New Testament to love God, to love ourselves so that we can love our neighbor. And then to build in, again, in our tradition, the means of grace to keep me living in all of that. Right. This is a very Wesleyan, the steps of recovery. I would go as far as to say it's the best disciple-making system I know of. Okay, so that's great. We have a system that is built on our theological tradition. We know that it is based on biblical principles. So why has the church fallen short in this? Why has the church not been a better witness to those who are affected by addictions? Yeah, and again, we're painting with a broad brush, but I would say in general it's true. I mean, even your own personal story. Yeah. Of a kind of a smoky basement, what the church tended to do is tend to sequester those people over there. Mm-hmm. And that's where we've gotten it wrong, because those people are us people. Like I said, everybody's got an it. Right. And so we tell everybody that not everybody needs, our ministry is called Choose Recovery. Mm-hmm. We tell everybody in our church, not everybody needs Choose Recovery, but everybody needs recovery. Yeah. And whether that's found in the rooms of a small group or a spiritual director or a band or a therapist, and we would suggest it's all of the above. Okay. We would suggest that it's all of the above, that you need to find a place of recovery. I Ironically, Mr. Wesley, again, I can't help this. So you're going to have to forgive me. I'm a Wesleyan to the core.
Yeah, let's go for it.
The early Methodist movement had what was called the penitent bands that were made for those men and women who could not live up to the high standards of the regular bands because they struggled with addictions to alcohol.
Yeah.
And if they were stringent in their format, Michael Henderson says in his book, but they much like Alcoholics Anonymous. So even Mr. Wesley saw that there was this group of folks that particularly struggled with substances in the 1700s,
right,
that needed a unique kind of disciple making that could happen for them. So the church has gotten it wrong that we haven't replicated what Mr. Wesley did.
Okay.
Yeah. Mr. Wesley, it's every Methodist, every church in the Wesleyan stream should look across the landscape of their ministry and see a place where people in recovery can recover. Or I would argue they're not Wesleyan. I would go as far as to say they're not Wesleyan.
Wow.
They might be an aberration of Wesley in the early Methodists, but they're not Wesleyan.
So then where have churches gotten it right? What are some places that you see that this is happening in a way that is vibrant and alive and celebrating Wesley's habits? And
Sure. So about 30 years ago, maybe a little bit less than 30 years ago, ironically, it took a Southern Baptist to kind of resurrect the idea of church and recovery. A guy named John Baker out at Saddleback Church, where Rick Warren has been the pastor for the last 42 years.
Yeah.
Started a thing called Celebrate Recovery. And it's been one of God's gifts to Christendom across the globe because they're a very globally minded church. And they've taken Celebrate Recovery across the globe. And we started that 22 years ago.
Okay.
This past Friday was our launch of our 22nd year.
Wow.
We started Celebrate Recovery with a handful of people. And it has become a movement, and it crosses denominational lines. It crosses from local churches. They now do it in halfway houses, and they do it in prisons. They do it all over the globe, and in Methodist churches and Lutheran churches and Catholic churches, in non-denom churches, and out of that has spawned lots of independent movements that use the 12 steps as its base, and are helping. Only heaven knows. I wouldn't even venture to say how many.
Right.
I know that in our church in Southwest Florida, I can't count the number. It's into the thousands over the 22 years who've come to Christ, who've been discipled, and who found freedom and healing and deliverance and life in Christ.
So, George, if somebody's listening today and said, look, all of that's great, but I'm not a pastor, I'm not a trained leader in my church, but boy, this is really something important. And I don't have a big church like you do with all the resources and staff and all that sort of thing, but says, I got to start somehow. What would you tell them?
Yeah. I would tell them 22 years ago, neither did I. So there were three of us on staff. Now we have a whole bunch, several dozens of people. Yeah. But back in those days, there were three of us. So I want to remind everybody that size isn't the issue. The average recovery, this was probably a decade ago statistic. The average CR was about 35 people. Wow. Celebrate Recovery group was about 35 folks.
Right.
Here's what I would say you can do. I would give this wisdom. Do what your dad did to you and go to an AA meeting. Probably an AA meeting that's meeting at your church. But if not, at another church or a community center or a hospital. Right. And find an AA meeting and just sit. Everybody's welcome. If it's an open meeting, you're welcome to sit and be a guest and just observe. Yeah. And I think what you'll find is that the Spirit of God is at work in those rooms.
Yeah.
The Spirit of God's at work in those rooms. If I can tell a story.
Please.
I have a son who for 15 years struggled with addictions. And after he made it out of a halfway house and had moved in, made it out of rehab and moved into a halfway house, he called me on his first night and he said, "Dad, would you take me to a recovery meeting?"
Wow.
And I took him to a recovery meeting, and I said, well, as I picked him up, I said, "Where are we going?" He goes, "We're going to your church, silly." And so we went to a recovery meeting. Here's the irony. It was a Wednesday night, and Bible study was letting out. Mm-hmm. And all these beautiful 30, 40, and 50-year-olds were leaving my church, about 70 or 80 of them. And standing in the corner were a bunch of teenagers and 20-year-olds in the smoking section, getting ready to go into the same fellowship hall where Bible study had been held the last hour. And for the first time, at that time, I'd been there about 17 or 18 years. And the first time in those 17 or 18 years, I was sitting in the social hall of my own church with a bunch of 20-year-olds. The F-bomb got dropped about 70 times in the 1 hour that I was in there. But it was the most holy, sacred room I had been in. And then I had the thought later that God's Spirit was just as much at work in that room where the F-bomb was dropped 70 times as it was in that very same room the hour before where they were studying the book of Philippians. And so what I would say to somebody is go sit in one of those rooms, listen to the stories, take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth and listen. Just listen. Do what Paul did when he walked around Athens. Walk around Athens, and your Athens is the addictions community. Go to some meetings and listen to the Holy Spirit, and then do what the Spirit tells you to do. Now, I would tell you there are resources out there. If it were me, I would say go buy the box set. I believe Zondervan still publishes it, of Celebrate Recovery. It's a soup to nuts, paint by numbers. Do what John Baker and the folks tell you to do. And you can grow a recovery ministry in the life of your church. But I think the starting point is to just go and listen. Just go and listen. I would say in all of that, pray for God to bring you the person of peace. And the way I discovered the person of peace in my community is I put in the worship folder, if you're a friend of Bill W. and you're interested in a Christ-centered, biblically based 12-step recovery ministry at Grace Church, meet me on Tuesday in room 6. And I had a dozen people show up. Wow. There are friends of Bill W's. That's kind of code for people in the recovery community, all in all of our churches, like your dad. Yeah. Now, he wasn't wearing a badge because that's why it's an anonymous program. Right. You don't wear a badge. You just don't. But they're in your church. And they would probably love to connect the dots between their faith that they're experiencing in your church and the recovery that they're experiencing in the rooms. And so if you could fan the flames of that and do it gently and humbly, not as the expert, because you're not, they're the expert. Right. And as you pray for the person of peace, in my case, it was a woman named Tanya who had 10 years of recovery, and she just lit our place on fire. I would tell you that it took about 3 to 4 years of doing it every Friday night for us to get to what I call the tipping point. It's not what I call, it's what some experts call the tipping point, where it switched from those people to us people. Right. But it took a lot of preaching, because I would bring testimonies from Friday night up onto the platform on Sunday morning and let people hear the stories of people's life transformation. And it began to build bridges between Sunday morning and Friday night.
That's beautiful. And I think about, friends of Bill W. and phrases like easy does it and things like that tell people that they are welcome. And so it's okay to use those things in the church. There's all sorts of ways to welcome.
The other thing I did, I would say this, and this is a Prevenient Grace thing that we did, is I preached 12 weeks on the 12 steps of AA and didn't tell my people until the 12th week. And I called the sermon series, I stole the title from Len Sweet's book, The Jesus Prescription for a Healthy Life. And so I preached week 1 on step 1, week 2 on step 2, week 3 on step 3. Wow. And I used the material from Celebrate Recovery, and also there's a hunger for healing that J. Keith Miller wrote several decades ago. There's a whole bunch of, he wrote another book called Sin, the Ultimate Addiction. So there's a whole library of Christian recovery, if you will, that are rooted in the 12 steps. There's a whole library of that stuff that's older than Celebrate Recovery that's out there and available for folks to use.
Well, George, I think that's really helpful to know that the church is probably closer to connecting in this ministry than they realize. And it may be just, it's not even a trip across the street. It might be just a trip next door or even just across the room where they can start to engage with this sort of ministry in a whole new way. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's at your fingertips.
Yeah.
It's right there.
Yeah.
It's right there. And, the God of the universe is for us. He's not against us.
That's right.
And he wants every local church to be vibrant and vital and connecting to people who are hurting. Deb Hirsch, that great missiologist, said, the heartbeat of the city is where the pain is. Mm. And that has been kind of for us, our marching orders. Where have we seen the pain in our community, whether it's in the trafficking area or whether it's in the addictions community? For us, special needs, the hungry, the homeless, all of those have been places of pain where we feel like it's in keeping with Jesus and John Wesley. So yeah.
So I want to bring this in a little more personally. You and I have talked about these sorts of things, but if someone's listening today and says, I don't need it in my church, I need it in my family. I have this family member who is struggling with this. How do I even start? That's the first question. Then I've got a follow-up to that.
Yeah. Well, I would say the place to start, for every addict, there is a community of codependence. Mm. And I would say the place to start would be in the Al-Anon rooms. And my wife and I found so much help and hope in the rooms of Al-Anon. Mm-hmm. We have a son who from 16 to about 30 overdosed, suicide attempts, homelessness, arrests, recovery, rehab, and all at the same time, mind you, while my church was the fastest growing United Methodist Church in America. Wow. So I'm preaching a gospel and seeing life transformation in my church that I'm not experiencing in my home. Yeah. And it was, and part of my discipline was to declare the gospel to be true, even though I wasn't experiencing it. Wow. And where my wife and I, sadly too late, found the tools. When I say too late, not too late. I mean, I wish we'd found it earlier. Right. My son is sober for 4 years. We praise Jesus for that. Mm. And doing remarkably well, given where he's been. Yeah. But we found great help in the rooms of Al-Anon that use the 12 steps and that give you the tools. Henry Cloud wrote that book, Boundaries. And I've said to people, I think there are 3 books you need. You need the Bible, you need the big book, and you need Henry Cloud's book, Boundaries. Yeah. Because everybody is codependent. Mm-hmm. Everybody struggles with self-differentiation and knowing where I end and you begin. And when I want something more for somebody than they want it for themselves, I'm being codependent. I'm not self-differentiated. Yeah. And so Al-Anon gave us tools. And it just gave us tools to know the greatest gift you give to a loved one, a friend, a family member who's struggling with addictions is a well you. It's right. Counterintuitive. We want to go fix the person. Yeah. That's our codependent impulse. And again, I would go back. It's in the pages of the Old Testament. Love God, love yourself so you can love your neighbor. Yeah. The 12 commandments, or the 10 commandments, 12 steps and 10 commandments. The 10 commandments.
Hang on.
The first 3 have to do with loving God. Mm-hmm. The last 6 have to do with loving our neighbor. The hinge and the longest is the Shabbat command, the right. Sabbath command. It's the longest of the commands. Wonder why? And it's the hinge command. So the 10 commandments don't say love God, love neighbor, and with what you got left over, love yourself. It's love God, love yourself, living into your baptismal vows, all of that, so that you can love your neighbor. And it's the impulse is, I love God, and I want to jump over to loving my neighbor who's struggling with addictions. And I'm saying, whoa. That's not the biblical order. Mm-hmm. The biblical order is love God, love yourself. Get into the rooms of Al-Anon. Get the tools yourself to self-differentiate. I would also lift up Pete Scazzero's work, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Yeah. You can do a self-led 8-week course yourself. Do it in 8 days or do it in 8 hours if you want. I would encourage you to gather a group of people. That is a tool to use. Get into rooms of Al-Anon. Maybe get into therapy yourself and get yourself ready to love appropriately and with healthy boundaries the person in recovery.
I'm just going to say that I think that's so helpful, especially that hinge, because that seems so selfish to us. Sometimes we think that we can't do that work. That's too selfish. We've got to give out and pour out. But we can't pour out if we don't have anything in ourselves to pour out.
Not even Jesus did that.
That's right.
So you remember, he gets word John the Baptist is killed, his cousin.
Yeah.
And he's on his way to pray to his eremos place, the wilderness, the desolate place, the quiet place where he went to be with his father. And he gets interrupted by the crowd. He ends up feeding the thousands. And then what happens next? Jesus goes back to the eremos place.
Yeah.
He was grieving, and he needed to grieve before, he needed to lament before his father. 1/3 of the Psalms are laments. He needed to pour out his sadness, maybe even his anger at Herod. And pour it out before the Father. And so even Jesus understood, even God in the flesh, the sinless one, understood, you have to love yourself. And it's I mean, there's a difference between being selfish and living with self-awareness.
Yeah.
They're two different things. And so I'm not saying forget about the person who's struggling. I believe if there's life, there's hope. And so we do profoundly care. And what you discover when you have a loved one who's struggling with addiction is that the fog lifts for you as you care for yourself. Yeah. And then you're able to care for the person. And I've discovered that all I am is a pointer. As I can say, hey, I'll go with you to a meeting, or, hey, have you thought about?
Yeah.
But then it becomes their responsibility. You don't fix anybody. You don't. All you do is point. All you do is point to the places of healing. Would you think about going and seeing Pastor George? Right. And sitting down. Yeah. And having a conversation. So I would speak a word to pastors here if I can.
Please.
If that's appropriate.
Please.
I want to speak a word to pastor and ministry leaders. The more appropriately vulnerable you are about your own addictions, afflictions, and compulsive behaviors, the more your people will be. And the degree to which you are not is the degree to which they will not. My first Sunday here, September 1st, 1996, I was leading the communion ritual. I lifted up the communion cup, and I had added a line to my communion ritual personal thing because I wanted to protect people as I'd gotten into my own recovery. And I said, and we use grape juice, not alcohol. So if you struggle with alcohol like I do, know that this is a safe place for you. Now, I'm 36 years old. Yeah. I'm pretty much the youngest guy in the room. And I've just outed myself as an alcoholic, not by intent, but just trying to protect people when they come to the communion table to know that we use grape juice and not alcohol. And all the air got sucked out of the room as everybody discovered that their brand new, wet behind the ear, first time lead pastor was an alcoholic in recovery, of course. Thank you, Jesus. And so I think we have to be vulnerable and create a space of appropriate vulnerability. I heard a wise person once say that vulnerability is appropriate to the degree that you're using it for somebody else's behalf and not to meet some own internal need for people to like me or to feel sorry for me. Right. Another way of putting it is, am I saying this so that God gets glory and people get help? You know, is God being honored? Are people getting help? And it's not to talk about how much beer I've spilled. That's not the part. It's just simply to identify. So my colleague, Wes Olds, who is the co-lead pastor at Grace Church with me. Yeah. My colleague, Wes Olds, raised in a United Methodist home. His father was a wonderful United Methodist pastor. He did not have the alcohol and drug history that my family had, but he would tell you that when he stands up in a recovery setting and in our church, he talks about his struggle with depression and anxiety. And and about how he's found help through medication and through counseling and through psychiatry and psychology, and through spiritual direction and through, those kinds of tools.
Right.
And so, all of us have a story to tell. It's a part of the sin problem. The world is wounded and broken, but not beyond repair. Not beyond repair.
That's right. So the follow-up question to that, George, is if someone is listening today and says, George, I know that I have a problem and I need to start to get help, but I don't even know where to go. What would you say to them?
I would say, if they're talking about their own, you mean their own struggle?
Yeah, their own problem. Yeah.
Yeah. Find a safe pastor, a safe counselor, Google Alcoholics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Sexual Addictions, Sexual Anonymous, Sexual Addictions Anonymous, SAA. Google it and find a meeting and go. Now, it takes a ton of courage.
Yeah.
And I would say, maybe even better yet, share it with a trusted person and ask them to go with you. Because it's easier. It's kind of like when you go to church. It's always easier if somebody goes with you to church for the first time.
That's right.
There are online meetings where you can remain completely anonymous.
Yeah.
So you just Google or search for, online Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and just listen to the stories. And when you hear that other folks have gotten help, it stirs faith in you that you can get help.
Right.
That you can get help. I would say if you are at a place where it's critical, and there could be somebody who's listening who's got a bottle of vodka right next to them.
Yeah.
Go to the emergency room.
Right.
Hospitals know how to handle folks who are struggling with addictions. If you're at a place where, the toxicity is getting so high in your body that you could die. And I've sadly been in the homes where that's happened. Go to the emergency room. But whatever you do, find help, please.
Yeah.
You matter to God, and you have value and worth. You're not defined by your addiction. At our church, we say, I'm a grateful follower of Jesus who's finding victory in recovery from, and then fill in the blank, whatever your area of recovery is.
Yeah. Well, George, I think that's a great place to leave it. What better hope and encouragement could we get than that? If people wanted to get in touch or learn more, where would you point them? How could they connect?
Sure. I would invite them to go to our church website. It's Grace Church. Think of electronic, gracechurch.com. My email address is there. If they want to email me there, they can just email me and I'd be glad to respond. If somebody wants to call me, I'll be glad to take the call. And I would say that our pastor of recovery, Arlene Jackson, loves to help churches start recovery ministries. We've had teams fly in and just observe and meet with some of our leaders. The other resource I would say that's on the website is there's under our resource tab is what's called CR recordings. And there's almost 10 years of lessons and testimonies. The lessons are good. The testimonies are spectacular.
Right.
They're just the true life stories of ordinary chair, pew sitting women and men like you and me who've experienced recovery. And I'm sad to say I pastor a fairly large church and my sermons are up there and I might get a few thousand views on a great sermon, mostly a few hundred and a few dozen. My wife's testimony on codependency is into the many thousands.
Wow. Yeah.
So my wife has more viewers of her story than my great preaching. So these stories are phenomenal. And there are some that are into the tens of thousands of views. We have ministries that use our testimonies in their church to help people in their recovery. So I would point them to those resources as well. They can watch online or on Facebook. our recovery services on Friday night and Monday night as well.
Great. Well, George, I'm proud to call you a friend and a colleague, and I so appreciate the gifts that you've offered us here and abroad.
My delight and joy.
My thanks again to George. I am so appreciative of his honesty and his candor about his own journey in recovery and in his family, and also the way it impacts the ministry of his church. I do want to emphasize, if you feel that you need help in any of these ways, just as George said, connect with a community, reach out to a hospital if you need to, reach out to a trusted professional, or even go to a meeting yourself. It is something that takes a lot of courage, but it is so important. Don't delay if that's you. I hope that you will take a minute to rate and subscribe, not only this episode, but others. It will help you get connected with all of the great ministry opportunities that we have at World Evangelism that come through this podcast. And we'd love to hear your questions, comments, suggestions for future episodes. You can reach us at podcast@worldmethodist.org. You can learn more about the ministries that we do on our website, worldmethodist.org. One of those that you're going to find is Metanoia Europe. Registration is open for that. It will be in Durham, England, August 29th through September 4th. This is for people who are interested in ministry, leadership development, and around evangelism, ages 18 to 35. Visit worldmethodist.org for more information. In today's show notes, you'll also find all of our social media connections. Connect with us. We'd love to go on this journey with you. Our thanks again to Christ Church Memphis for sponsoring this episode. And thank you for listening. I'm Rob Haynes, and this is World Methodist Evangelism's Real Faith, Real World podcast.